You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs.
Hello, and welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader. And today, we're talking about old world writing in the new world. How much of it is real? How do we know? What do we expect to see to make it authentic? All that and a bunch of rants. Get ready to think critically.
When the day is spent, funny beady blokes you will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader.
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
I'm great on take 3.
Awesome, right? Yeah, listen, stuff happens. The words don't come trippingly from our tongues all the time, so we have to go back and, redo stuff. It's fine.
Yes. Thank you, editors.
Yes, we are not professional.
Yeah, do not try this at home.
Exactly.
We're not professionals. But today, we are going to talk about something that's kind of interesting. Would you like to say the word?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's epigraphy. So it claims that there are artifacts all over North America that have written inscriptions usually on stones, that reflect the actual writings of pre-Columbian, European, Asian, African visitors to the New World.
Okay, and we're going to touch on a couple different artifacts real briefly, but we're kind of going to categorize things for the most part. Because we've talked about the Newark Holy Stones, and that's
exactly.
we can use that as a launching point because we've talked about them before.
Yeah, for sure.
And they supposedly had Hebrew writing on them.
Right, exactly. And that's kind of a common theme. And now, the deal is, I think that it would be fair to say that occasionally we go off on tangents in the podcast and that maybe we beat around the bush. So right now I'm promising that I'm not going to beat around the bush. Today we're going to be talking about claims of inscribed stones inscribed in European, Asian, and African languages in the New World from before Columbus. And here's the deal. They're all either fakes or misinterpretations. And that's it. So thanks a lot, Sarah. This was a wonderful podcast.
Oh, no. We got 45 minutes.
Oh, damn. All right. Well, then we're going to have to do some beating around the bush.
Not necessarily, because we can break these down into different groups. Because like you said, there's claims of different popular pre-Columbian cultures contacting. And there have been some new ones thrown into the mix thanks to shows like Ancient Aliens and Unearthed America.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, before we start with any of the specific ones, let me give 2 examples in terms of context. Because this is all about, all right, could pre-Columbian people have gotten to the Norse did. We know that in Newfoundland and Eastern Canada. So
that's true.
So the deal here is, how do we assess the validity of a claimed inscription? And in order to do that, I want to bring up 2 sites that are indirectly relevant to this conversation. The first is a site in New Mexico, near the town of Tularosa. And it's one of my favorite places in the world. It's and you all out there listening to this podcast, if you're anywhere near southern New Mexico, near Tularosa, this is a place you can visit. It's open to the public. It's on land administered by the Bureau of Land Management. And it's the Three Rivers Petroglyph site. It is the best kept secret in southern New Mexico in terms of prehistoric art. It's just gorgeous. There are thousands of pieces of rock art along this very interesting geological feature. It's a volcanic ridge with lots of blocky chunks of basalt. And on virtually every surface, there's art. There are inscriptions, not letters, not an alphabet, but various pieces of art. And there are images of animals and images of insects and fish and snakes, and also anthropomorphic images that look like people. And then there are these kind of trippy geometric shapes. It's incredibly cool. There's a parking area there. They have usually a couple of 2 volunteer rangers on hand to kind of help you through it. It's a great trail, lots and lots of art. Now, the deal is that right there at that site, there also is there are the remains of an ancient habitation. The habitation dates the same period as the art. It's around not between AD 900 and 1400. The culture is Mogollon, Jornada Mogollon specifically. And so you have an instance in which you've got beautiful, amazing prehistoric art right in association with the community of people who are responsible for most of that art.
And, which is actually kind of unusual.
I mean, that's really cool that you have direct evidence that people there, people living there at the time, and the images, the kind of the iconographic images that are on the art, you find on their ceramics. So there's this wonderful collection or correlation. Now, the 99% of what archaeology digs up is not spectacular tombs, great hoards of gold. 99% of what we dig up are the mundane traces of everyday life. So in that village, that's where you find the mundane traces of everyday life. That's what archaeology really is all about. And to be able to associate those traces with this amazing art site, bonus, right?
Right.
Now, the second example I want to give you is another place that's open to the public. And this one is even more directly relevant. It's a national monument. It's in western New Mexico, called El Morro National Monument. And there's you park there, there's a museum there are trails. El Morro is this enormous monolith. It's this huge rock that's a mountain. And at the base of this huge rock, there was a more or less permanent source of water. Now, this is in a very dry region. So people for generations have known, if you're traveling through western New Mexico, follow the trail that takes you past El Morro, because you will find a place where you can water your horses and fill up your canteens with water, because it is a more or less permanent source. Nice. Since 1605, settlers in the area, immigrants, people coming into the region from the outside, have stopped at El Morro and traditionally have carved their initials, carved messages, put a date in the rock in and around where that permanent pool of water is located. I believe the earliest one dates to 1605, and it's literally the Spanish governor of the territory passed through, saw the water, carved his name, talked about, in Spanish, it basically says, "We were here," and went on his way. Since 1605, for centuries now, up until it became a national monument, and we stopped that because it became graffiti, people have been putting their names on that wall, leaving epigraphic coded messages on that wall, because they've stopped there, essentially said, "We were here," and then moved on. But here's the deal. If you use El Morro as the center of a circle and draw a circle a diameter of 100 miles, all throughout that area, you will find mundane archaeological traces of the people who traveled through that area and left their marks on that wall. So you will find evidence of the Spanish explorers. You will find evidence of English-speaking immigrants. And you won't necessarily find the exact remnants of those individuals who wrote their name on the wall. But you can see diagnostically, okay, these were the conquistadors. These were the Spanish explorers. Here were the English settlers moving through New Mexico and headed to California. So that's what archaeologists absolutely expect and require. We've got a situation again in which, we've got messages written in stone, but we have direct, physical, archaeological, often mundane evidence of the presence of people bearing those cultures traveling through that area. And that's the key. When we look at epigraphic claims of, and it doesn't make any difference who they are, ancient Hebrews or Romans or Egyptians or Celts or the Norse, whoever they are, the archaeological law is, if they spent enough time to stay in one place and write a message, then they spent enough time here to lose stuff, to throw stuff away, to put stuff away for safekeeping, to discard stuff that was no longer useful to them. And archaeology is all about finding that stuff, by the way, which is diagnostic of the particular cultures who left it behind.
Yeah.
Without that, we are in a real quandary archaeologically, because without that, we are being asked to believe that people in the past could be so assiduously and obsessively neat that they never left any mundane traces of their existence behind, beyond the fact that they carved their name on a wall. From my perspective as an archaeologist, and Sarah, I bet everybody who's done archaeological research, that's just not plausible.
Most people listening to this and who are recording this can look around their houses and know that it's just not possible for us to not to leave something behind. I mean, I'm not saying we're all pigs, but I am saying that, think about all the times you've thrown something away. You go to a movie, you throw something away. You go grocery shopping, you throw something away. Something falls out of your purse. It's the same processes are happening back in the past that are happening today. It's just their version of a supermarket was, wherever they were gathering their herbs and their plants, or wherever they killed their animal at, or the trail that they're walking down. You're going to lose stuff. You're going to throw things away, things that are no longer useful to you. And that stuff gets kept and we find it.
That's what the archaeological record is all about. Yeah.
The archaeological record is garbage, literally. So if there's no garbage, or even if there's no intentional settlements, there's no evidence of these people being here ever.
Right.
And we do get asked a lot by alternative historians and people who believe in even ancient aliens, or who believe in, the Celts being here, or the Hebrews being here, or people coming over from Egypt. We're constantly being asked to accept the fact that these people are here based on a story, a rumor, a thing that someone has seen that they think looks like it might belong to another culture, but in the complete absence of any other evidence of these people being here.
Oh, exactly. There's a good example of that in the American Southeast when, in the early 16th century, when Hernando de Soto shows up with his 600 plus men. And they spent 2 years traveling through the American Southeast, right? And they had a number of folks in the expedition who recorded this, who kept journals of what they saw, of their interaction with native people. And we know from all of the historical documentation that these Spanish guys brought with them their own material culture. Well, of course they did. Their weapons, their swords. And they also brought along with them stuff that they knew they would trade with the local natives. Today, the archaeologists in the American Southeast have done this amazing job of basically putting on a map, it's like breadcrumbs, of the evidence of, for example, beads, glass beads that were made in Italy that we know were brought by the Spanish explorers with them to trade with the Indians, because the Indians they wanted these beads. It was something that they were completely unfamiliar with. And in archaeological excavations across the Southeast, you literally can draw a line tracing the expedition of Hernando de Soto by putting little push pins in maps showing where these glass beads have been found. Little copper bells, again, I think these were made in Spain, that were brought with them by the Spanish explorers, who again traded them with the Indians. And you can again put these beads on maps, these bells, and say, oh my God, this exactly follows the directions given in these journals as to where the Spanish explored in the Southeast. So you literally can trace their expedition by looking at the material culture that they brought with them. And the deal is, if you have a few hundred Spanish explorers bringing with them a couple of bucket loads of beads and bells, and if 400 years after the fact, almost 500 years after the fact, we can trace their walkabout on the basis of that the material culture, I think that's a really good model for what we would expect to find archaeologically in any other instance, pre-Columbian or whatever, of, these people were here, they came through the Southwest, they came through the Northeast, they came through the Midwest, and their interaction with local people, their losing the standard processes of the production of archaeological sites would apply, and we as archaeologists would be finding this stuff all of the time.
Right.
The key point that we're making right up front here is that in none of the specific cases that we can talk about or that anybody has asserted and has brought up, there is not only can we not say, well, yeah, there's a wealth of evidence for the presence here of these groups of people. What I can say fairly is for most of these instances, there's not a single standard archaeological artifact that would support the claim that ancient Celts or ancient Phoenicians or ancient Israelites or ancient Egyptians were actually in the New World in this pre-Columbian context. And that is kind of an insurmountable obstacle for us archaeologists, because our stock and trade, the gold standard for us is, like you said, Sarah, it's garbage. It's the things that people... I've often thought this, and you probably have as well, that when we're digging at an archaeological site and we are obsessively going through stuff that people 5,000 years ago thought so little of that they just tossed it, that if they could see us, they would probably think we were mentally deranged. Why are you... I mean, can you imagine somebody concentrating their efforts today, well, Bill Raftery has done it, at a modern landfill and spending all their time, up to their armpits in people's trash? And most people would think, well, that's kind of odd. That's what we do. Yeah. That's the majority of what we do. I think people have some people outside of archaeology might assume that what we do is we enter fabulous tombs, and who wouldn't want to do that? No, I mean, what we're looking at places that people threw a bunch of junk away, and that's our stock and trade, right?
But that's okay though, because I did a brief stint in garbology when I was in college, and it's a very interesting field. And garbology is like a thing. It's a real thing even today. You can find people that specialize in it, and not just in the archaeological field. They apparently use it a lot in criminology.
Oh, sure.
And in law enforcement. But it's interesting how complete a picture you can get of a household just by going through their garbage, which helps with the validity of the findings that we have in archaeology, because we are just looking at people's garbage, but we're able to reconstruct, maybe not a household, but you do get a nice glimpse into a culture, an established culture.
Right. Well, I hear. Let me take the train out of the station a little bit. One of the key things I think that we have to point out is that by an archaeologist saying, hey, look, we can identify a culture based on the stuff those people threw away. That's a really important point, that garbage is diagnostic. It's culturally diagnostic. So that the garbage that you would find in my compost heap or the stuff I pull out to the curb is not going to look anything like the garbage that a 17th century settler of New England threw behind their house in the bottle dump. It's just not going to look the same. Different raw materials, the same materials used differently, different styles of materials, and that wouldn't look anything like the garbage you'd find outside of a Navajo hogan from the 1500s, and it's not going to look anything like the garbage you would find in an Australian Aborigine camp. That garbage is a fingerprint. It's like archaeological DNA of a particular culture. And I love that y'all know that one of my favorite comedians of all time is George Carlin. Brilliant guy. Well, Carlin did a whole routine about your stuff and how your house is essentially a container for your stuff. And when you leave your house, you go on vacation, you bring a subset of that stuff with you. And think in terms of, so somebody living in Egypt 4,000 years ago, or somebody living in Ireland 2,000 years ago, or ancient Hebrews in the Middle East from a couple thousand years ago, they have their own particular variety of stuff. And an archaeologist is never going to mistake one of those piles of stuff from another. They're different cultures. And if those people traveled and explored, they would bring a subset of that stuff, George Carlin calls it stuff, along with them. And the thing I liked about the routine also was that George Carlin actually kind of hinted at the archaeological implications when he said that everybody's stuff is different. So what Carlin said is, my shit is stuff. Your stuff is shit.
Right.
But what he's saying, of course, is that, even at an individual level, everybody's stuff, look around, anybody listening to this, look around your room, look around your house, look around your office, and you will see stuff that uniquely defines who you are. And it doesn't look like your neighbor's stuff because they're a different person with different beliefs, different attitudes, whatever. The point here is so that wherever, in the specific cases that we'll finally get around to after all this bush beating, those places where people have claimed, look, there's writing here. This writing comes from the old world. The context is pre-Columbian, so they were visiting the new world. In every one of these cases, we demand, in fact, that there be evidence of the stuff left behind by the people who ostensibly put those messages on the walls. Just as in the case of Three Rivers, we've got Native American sites all around there, the same people who made that art. Just as in the case of El Moro, the people who left their messages on that wall in the area all in eastern Arizona and western New Mexico, the Spanish settlers and explorers, the English-speaking settlers and explorers, they have their houses, their burial grounds, their garbage pits, and we can, as archaeologists, dig that stuff up, recognize it, and distinguish the Native American stuff from the English stuff, from the Spanish stuff, and that's clear evidence that those people were there.
And style is going to be important again later on in the conversation when we finally get back to where we started.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times when we're looking at the different writing styles that are left behind, it's easy to spot the fakes based on the linguistic evidence at the time and the linguistic styles at the time that these are supposedly claimed to have been made. It's just as important as finding the stuff, because also, okay, we don't have any stuff, but now we've got this writing. So how old is the writing supposed to be? Well, it's supposed to come from this ancient time. Well, that's not the style that it looks like, and the experts are saying that's not the style that it is. They're actually saying it's a more modern style, which, I don't know, is a way of debunking.
Yeah, it is. As an archaeologist, I'm biased, which is, okay, you can make those arguments about, well, it looks authentic. It's got the right kind of grammar, the right syntax, the right.
No, I'm with you. If there's no evidence, if there's no stuff around it, it's still weird, and it's not enough for me to accept it as authentic.
And you know what's funny about that too, Sarah, is I've heard both arguments from supporters, from people who believe these are genuine. Both arguments, and they're absolutely contradictory. One is, how can you be skeptical about that document? The writing is absolutely perfect. It is perfectly. It's not there are no anachronisms. It's a perfect match for what the time period we're suggesting would reflect. But I've heard the exact opposite argument from the same people. When an epigrapher, a linguist, says, no, there are these mistakes, then the argument is, well, of course, because the people leaving these messages were not scholars. They were explorers. Right. So it's one of those deals where if you win, you win. If you lose, you win. That no matter what you argue about this, they go, well, that's an evidence of it being authentic. Personally, here's the deal. And I'm sure epigraphers would be angry at this and would dispute this. But my own personal opinion is, it is relatively, let's put that in italics and underline it, it's relatively easy to fake an inscription that looks authentic. It's virtually impossible to fake an entire archaeological site, which is the village where the people lived who made that inscription. And that's
even the camp where the guy who wrote the thing was staying,
right. So in other words, if you know enough about the language, if you have the right kinds of tools, conceivably, you can make a message that certainly can fool a lot of people, and at least cause controversy. But the deal is, it's, again, how in the world could anybody fake an entire archaeological site? That's why we don't find those. Because that's too hard to do. It's a lot easier to scratch make some scratch marks in a rock and say, oh, look, that's Ogham. That's ancient Irish. That's a lot easier than making and having it look authentic and stratigraphically in context. A fireplace, a place where people were making tools, a burial, an old house remain. That takes some serious archaeological chops that I don't think most people have.
And your weather must be nice up there tonight.
Yeah, we've got. I live on this beautiful country road, and right on the other side of the road is a river, and we're lucky tonight that some days you'll get, honest to God, 100 motorcycles. A group of people all coming down the road at the same time, and the cats all hide under the bed because it's really loud. But not much we can do about it.
Let's go to a break, and when we come back, we will start discussing the different fraudulent writings that have been found throughout the Americas.
Telling a different story to the traditional lines of archaeology, the Archaeologist podcast seeks the stories and ideas that are often overlooked or not considered real archaeology. Video games, anarchism, and archaeology in the middle of hostile areas. Host Tristan doesn't search under the rocks. He destroys them. Available on iTunes every fortnight.
Okay, and we're back with the podcast, and we're going to keep talking about the different types of writing that have been found in the Americas and the validity of them. Sure. So where do you want to start?
Well, we've started this conversation weeks ago when we had Brad Lepper on about the Newark Holy Stones, and that was an instance in which a couple of artifacts with Hebrew writing were found in. Ostensibly, they were found in contexts in burial mounds in Ohio, and we talked a lot about the validity of those specific of the actual writing, the orthography being used. Right. Was it authentic? And was it 2,000 years old? They talked about the fact that in the first artifact found that the orthography, that is the writing, was entirely modern. And that if the site was 2,000 years old, you wouldn't see that kind of Hebrew at all, but that's the kind of Hebrew that people were familiar with in the middle of the 19th century. And then the second artifact had much more authentic looking orthography. The faker had learned his lesson or her lesson, and it produced a more authentic looking piece of writing. But in the case of the Newark Holy Stones, and this is going to be the theme and these other ones that we're going to talk about, there was nothing else found at these sites that would suggest that ancient Hebrews from the Middle East had been in Ohio 2,000 years ago. And to continue with the Hebrew theme here, in of all places, New Mexico. That's one of the odd things about these written documents, is that these written inscriptions
pop up all over the place.
Yeah, isn't that weird? If you've got Hebrews sailing on boats across the Atlantic, you would expect to find the Hebrew writing somewhere, on the East Coast, right?
Right. That's the thing. That's one of my biggest problems with these. We'll get back to them in a second, but the whole claim that, there were foreigners here in the Americas before Columbus, and I have that evidence because I found proof of it in the middle of the damn country. It's like, okay, so you're telling me that they sailed their boats all the way to one of the two coasts and then marched all the way in to the middle of the country before leaving any record that they were here?
We see you're limiting the conversation here, Sarah. What if they parachuted in? That could happen.
I don't think I've ever actually considered that.
Well, there you go. You got to expand your horizons.
They hang glided.
It could be that. But isn't that weird? The Heavener runestone, which is supposed to be Viking runes, it's in the middle of stinking Oklahoma. Come on, guys. Understand that the Norse were in North America before Columbus, and they were here in northeastern Canada. They were here in Newfoundland, and the context there pretty clearly shows they came from they crossed the Atlantic, they landed on the coast, and they explored somewhat in the interior. The stone that I was starting to talk about, it's called the Los Lunas, Lunas, after the local town, the nearest town, which is like 25 miles away, the Los Lunas Decalogue stone. And just like one of the Newark Holy Stones is a Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, this is supposed to be the 10 Commandments. And the deal is, I've actually seen the Los Lunas Decalogue stone. It's, I think maybe appropriately, you reach it through the town dump. You have to go to the town dump in Los Lunas, and you hike through the dump, and then you work your way off into the desert. And it's really stark and beautiful. And you follow a trail, and there in this little alcove is a piece of basalt with an orange patina over it, and then somebody has pecked through that patina what clearly is a long message in Hebrew. Now, there are a number.
Is it actually Hebrew? Because that's another problem.
Yeah, no, it's Hebrew. You can read it. It
Oh,
really
okay.
is Hebrew. I recognize the letters, and a number of people, including people who absolutely reject the fact that it's authentic, understand what it says. I mean, they argue about some errors in it, but those are the same errors that supporters say, well, that's what you'd expect from people who are not entirely literate in Hebrew, because the people 2,000 years ago, and it's that's pointless circular argument. But here's the deal. The very first written description announcing this discovery is 1933. So you've got lots of people living in this area before that, and nobody mentions the inconvenient fact that there's a stone with a bunch of Hebrew writing on it. Now, the 1933 reference, the person who actually brought Hibben, who is a well-known archaeologist, brought him out to see it. The person who was his contact, who brought him out there, said that he remembered seeing it 50 years before when he was a boy. But we have only this kind of indirect testimony that that was the case. So in actual fact, the first we can say, oh yeah, that existed, was 1933. So again, that's kind of interesting. Well, how come this hasn't been talked about for at least decades and even centuries before? But what's also really interesting, and one of the things that I noticed, is that, being familiar with petroglyphs and being familiar with basalt, and this is a piece of basalt, it's abundantly clear that not only did whoever inscribed this, not only did they carve through this orange patina, but there were places where the patina had already sloughed off just by erosion, and it exposed the dark basalt interior. Well, the letters had gone through that material as well, and there was no patina that had developed on those letters. So it was pretty clear that, no, this was not something that had been done millennia ago and had then weathered. In fact, it's something that had been done clearly very recently, even cutting through recent sloughing off of the exfoliation of the external surface of the basalt. And what's really cool is that, immediately adjacent, so close that if you stood in front of the Los Lunas Decalogue stone and you spit, if you can spit really far, there are actual petroglyphs right nearby in the same rock, and these are animal glyphs, and those are extremely weathered. So very clearly, they've been there for a long time, and freezing and thawing and the rain and the sun have served to repatinate the carved message. So it's kind of, again, it's really interesting. Here, on the one hand, we have a message that's supposed to be 2,000 years old that looks as fresh as like maybe it was less than 100 years old. But right next to it, you have petroglyphs that are supposed to be around about the same age that exhibit extreme weathering.
Is there anyone there who tries to defend the difference, like tries to give you an explanation as to why one looks different than the other?
I have not read anything like that, and I think that essentially the folks who support the authenticity of Los Lunas aren't even aware that that's a problem. So it's not like they need to respond to that because they don't know what's the problem. And then, okay, let's ignore all that, Sarah. Let's forget that argument. I'm full of it. I'm totally wrong. There's a lot of archaeology being done in western New Mexico, which is where this is found. And all the people doing archaeology in this part of the world, they find Native American stuff. They find that stuff that George Carlin talks about. They find stuff of Spanish explorers and Spanish colonists, and they find the stuff of more recent English-speaking explorers and colonists of that part of the world. But they don't find anything that dates to 2,000 years ago that reflects a Middle Eastern presence in western New Mexico.
Well, that's because the lost tribes of Israel were really clean.
Well, listen. Here's the argument.
We just had that discussion, but still.
But here's the argument I've actually heard. Are you ready? So something like Los Lunas, that's a sacred site. They put the 10 Commandments there. That's sacred.
Right.
People wouldn't throw their garbage out at a sacred place. They would.
No, but they would have other iconography and stuff around for the sacred place.
You know what? Even that argument is archaeologically very naive. And what I do when people say that, they go, well, these sites, they're sacred. And so the people who left these messages behind, they wouldn't have thrown out their garbage. They would have been very, very neat about it. I then say, listen, I have a bibliography for you of church archaeology in Western Europe.
Right.
They excavate churches and they find garbage. They find the stuff that people threw away, the stuff that people lost. Well, yeah. And, you can't argue that there are places more sacred to the people who use them than churches. And yet the archaeology of churches finds exactly the kinds of evidence that I'm expecting and that you folks are saying, no, you wouldn't find it there because they're sacred. That is the height of archaeological naivete. If there were Hebrews and living long enough in Western New Mexico 2,000 years ago, well, by God, they would lose stuff. They would throw stuff away. And archaeologists, when you consider, I once did this brief survey, and I asked the SHPO offices, State Historic Preservation offices in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island and Ohio. I said, in the average year over the last 10 years, in all your CRM projects, all the projects where you're doing cultural resource management, highway corridors or sewage treatment plants or whatever, how many test pits are excavated in this state in a given year? And when I did the survey, which was like 10 or 15 years ago, in Connecticut, it was like 10,000 individual test pits over the course of a year. In Rhode Island, which is a much smaller state, it was 5,000 to 7,000. Massachusetts, it was 20,000. Ohio, it was 100,000. I mean, so literally, if you look at over the course of years, archaeologists have, across the face of the United States, have excavated literally millions of test pits. That's not hyperbole. It's millions. And so the issue then is, in all of those millions of test pits, have archaeologists ever found a piece of mundane archaeological evidence that was not Native American or not post-Columbus settlers of the New World? And the answer to that question is, as far as we know, and this stuff is in large measure, it's not secret stuff. I mean, you can access the test pit results. The answer to that is none. Those things are simply not found. Now, the two arguments I've heard is, number one, you archaeologists wouldn't recognize this stuff if you saw it, which is just insulting. I mean, I'm afraid that's not the case.
Yes, but you, dude, who have never left the country, you totally will know what it looks like.
Well, that's kind of a crazy thing to say. I think that what I would say about myself is, if I, in a test pit survey, found something and I didn't know what it wasn't something that I was expecting. It was not a Native American spear point. It was not Native American ceramics. It wasn't some local colonial stuff that I was familiar with. I would take it to somebody who would know. That's what we do. We're scientists. That has never happened to me, and it's not happened to any archaeologist who I know about. The other argument, and this is the unfortunate one, is we're all part of a conspiracy. We know we have found this stuff. We're trying to keep it quiet. And
my answer to that one, because I get that I'm closed-minded. I get both of those a lot. And my response is always, what difference would it make if for a minute that we pretended like all this was real? What difference is it going to make? Because it's not going to change reality as it is today. There's not some magical force field that's going to lift and reveal a reality beyond what we can see if there really were a great archaeological conspiracy that spans the entire globe, because that's easy.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's always my response. It's like, do you know how hard it is to have a conspiracy that large? It's impossible.
Those are two really important points. The point they made at first was, well, how would that why would we worry about that? What benefit?
Yeah.
What benefit would accrue to us archaeologists if, when we found stuff proving that ancient Hebrews were in New Mexico, why would we hide that from people?
Exactly.
What? Are you kidding? Why would we hide that? And the other, I have come to the conclusion that any conspiracy that requires more than about 2 or 3 people is impossible to keep quiet. It doesn't happen.
Especially, I mean, do you know archaeologists? It's just not going to happen.
Are you kidding? Archaeologists drink too much. They brag too much. Now, if somebody found Hebrew artifacts in New Mexico at the bar that night, he'd be telling people.
Exactly.
So
buy him you think there's a conspiracy? Find an archaeologist, buy him a couple beers, and wait about an hour.
But now remember, the conspiracy theorists also believe that we didn't land on the moon, that a couple of 100,000 NASA workers and companies that work for NASA all know that, and they've been able to keep it quiet.
Again, another giant conspiracy. Seriously? I mean, the only giant conspiracy that works is lizard people, and that's because they have mind control.
Yeah. When the military was working on the stealth fighters, and that is a major military secret. That's a thing where you tell anybody, they kill you. Right. But it's actually the case that I think it was Revell. I don't know if they still are in existence. They make these beautiful models of planes and boats and stuff. Well, they were selling a model of a stealth fighter that was actually a pretty accurate guess of what the real stealth fighter actually looked like, based on rumors that they heard. So even in the case of something as important for national security as the design of a warplane, enough details leaked out that a model maker could make something that was, wow, that's a pretty
model. Dead on. Yeah.
So if the military can't keep secrets like that, what are the odds that a loose affiliation of thousands of archaeologists across the world could keep something like that secret? It's just, okay. I'll be honest with you, that's a dumb accusation. It's just
no. Okay, so let's talk about one of the artifacts that hits a little closer to home. And I know we've had a request to do an entire show on the Kensington Runestone, but other than the actual controversy around the Kensington Runestone, I really don't think it can hold up an entire episode, simply because, in my opinion, and of course it's the only opinion that counts.
What about my opinion? What the hell?
But I think that there is no way in hell the Kensington Runestone is a real runestone. And I think you agree with me based on your statement earlier in the show.
I think that the odds are extremely low that the Kensington Runestone is genuine. But now let's do a little sidebar here. If tomorrow somebody found definitive proof that the Norse were in Minnesota,
right,
that would not rock, and that the Kensington Runestone was legit, it wouldn't rock my world. What rocks my world would be they were in Minnesota, they sat there, they had interaction with the Indians, a bunch of them were killed, they made this runestone. It would rock my world if there was no mundane archaeological evidence for their presence in Wisconsin. That would call into question everything I know about how the archaeological record is formed and the value of the archaeological record in reconstructing the past.
And to be clear for people who don't know, there is no evidence of the Norse being in Minnesota or any of the surrounding areas, regardless of what people think.
No.
And that's the major problem with the Kensington Runestone. That and the way it was found, the way it was stored, the way it mysteriously vanished and then reappeared, and the biggest debate I see based on the Kensington Runestone, and this one's different only because it does look a lot like the runes are real.
It can be read for sure.
Yeah, it can be read. It makes sense. It's not gibberish. But depending on who you ask, the style is either the right age or it is too young or too new.
Right. And they're also right.
I know that has caused some kind of debate, but I know that the people who are rooting for it to be real in the academic community have recently all changed their opinions for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that there was quite the debate academically over if it was authentic writing or not.
Right.
I don't think anybody ever actually believed that the Kensington Runestone was really an American runestone.
Right. for those interested, here's what it says. Here's the English translation of what's on the runestone.
Right.
8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians on a discovery voyage from Vinland westward. We had anchored by 2 rocky islets one day's voyage north from this stone. We had fished a day. After we came home, we found 10 men red with blood and dead. Ave Maria, deliver from evil. We have 10 men at sea to look after our ship, 14 days voyage from this island, year 1362. So this is, now understand, the Norse were in Newfoundland around AD 1000.
Right.
So all this assumes is, well, 362 years later, they're traveling west. Now, there's a problem with that, in that at this point, the Greenland colony and certainly the American colony had long in Newfoundland had long been abandoned, and things were like the Little Ice Age was hitting, and icebergs were dominating in the North Atlantic, and so the Norse actually were leaving. They were heading east back to their home territories in Europe and Iceland, and they were abandoning the Greenland colony and abandoning their colonies, their settlements in eastern North America. So it's kind of weird that, well, what the hell are they doing 362 years later? While their world is shrinking, why are they expanding into Wisconsin? I'm sure those are arguments that can be made. There are alternate arguments. And you do hear, you're right, you hear a lot of arguments about the minutia, the particulars of every letter on that every rune on that runestone, about, is it legit? Could it have been faked by this guy back in the 19th century, this Olaf Ullmann? Was he smart enough to do it? Were there things on that runestone that nobody could have known in the 19th century that we now understand? Those are really interesting arguments. However, all those arguments aside, where the hell are these people living? Where's the remnants of their village? Where they're fishing, they're burying dead guys?
Exactly. The stone clearly makes statements about events that should be seeable in the archaeological record that are very absent.
Right.
Like you said, where are these 10 people buried? Did they, I mean, even if they incinerated them, where did they put the ashes? Where were the fires? Where were they camping? Where's the boat?
Well, exactly. What happened to these guys?
Yeah.
Everywhere. No, I'll disagree with one thing you said. I think you said earlier that you're not saying that all people are pigs. Sarah, all people are pigs. They leave, and maybe not even intentionally. It's just, we leave, we drop stuff. I have students, I don't do it anymore, but I used to have students do an exercise where I said, just walk across campus and pick up all the trash that you find.
Right.
And pens and change and broken eyeglasses. It was amazing the amount of stuff that got picked up. And I told the students, I said, some of the stuff is going to end up on paths. People are going to step on them, ground it into the dirt. And if you come and dig this campus, do an archaeological dig, you're going to find stuff representing the students who walked across this campus. And you'll find it 100 years from now. You'll find it 1,000 years from now. That's what we're talking about. There is a book by Alice Beck Kehoe, who is a very well-regarded professional anthropologist. She's got a PhD, professor of anthropology, on the Kensington runestone. And she comes out in the book on the side of authenticity. She believes that the thing is legit. She's one of the few scientists willing to say that, and good for her. Alice is a scientist. She's not a polemicist, and she's not, at least on this issue, she's not saying crazy stuff. And in the book, she very honestly and forthrightly points out that there have been a number of archaeological digs in the immediate vicinity of where the Kensington runestone was found. People, in fact, looking for the kinds of evidence that we require as archaeologists. And Alice, again, being committed to the scientific method, freely agrees and admits there is absolutely nothing, not one artifact found in the vicinity of the runestone and in the surrounding region that would suggest or support the claim that the runestone is authentic. In other words, the kinds of things that are found at L'Anse Meadow, the kinds of things that are found in northeastern Canada, Patricia Sutherland, who has done a lot of the heavy lifting on this, was found Norse artifacts in pre-Columbian contexts in northeastern Canada, those kinds of things, boat rivets, soapstone spindle whorl, ring-headed bronze pin, a brass balance, yarn, wool from sheep, all of this stuff found in pre-Columbian contexts in eastern Canada. And yet here around the Kensington runestone, we have this amazing rune, not a single artifact found in any archaeological excavation. That, again, from my perspective, that's a nail in the coffin lid. The coffin lid is a little bit open because people might still in the future find something. And the deal is, if that happens, I'm not wrong for being skeptical. You're never wrong for being skeptical. You're wrong if you accept stuff without skepticism. And if evidence is forthcoming that proves, yep, they were there definitively, and yep, that means that the Kensington runestone is that much more likely to have been genuine, that's great. That's wonderful. But until that happens, I think we're better, as you say, we are much better off assuming that things are fake, the bar is high, prove us wrong, go for it.
Now, in Keogh's defense, it has come to my attention that, and this is a story that I have heard secondhand, so if Dr. Kehoe would like to come on the show, I would love to have her. But I do believe that she has changed her opinion on the validity of the stone, and she is now no longer a supporter.
Yeah, I would love to hear that directly from Al.
Yeah, I would.
I mean, she's a great person, and she's incredibly bright. And
I love her book.
Yeah.
I'm going to link the book.
Her stuff on the ghost dance is wonderful. I had heard that as well, but I think I might have heard it from you, actually, that maybe she has backed off on that. I went online and tried to see, what new she has said, if she's come to any different conclusion, and I haven't been able to find it. So I don't know that that's the case. But if
I'm going to chase her down and just ask her, because why not?
Exactly. I mean, I actually reviewed that book for, I think, the Journal of Ethnohistory, and I got a very, Alice and I have locked horns before, but she actually wrote me a very nice note saying, when I saw that Fader was reviewing the book, I thought, oh, look out. And she said, you know what, I did a very, although we disagree, it was a fair assessment. And that was, that's the right thing to do. And
I'm very impressed with her in general as a researcher and a writer, because we had to read Controversies in Archaeology, which I think is the book you're talking about.
No, I'm talking about, she has a monograph on the Kensington runestone.
I'll see if I can't look that one up too. Controversies in Archaeology we had to read for my Ancient Aliens class that I took, and in the preface of that book, she explains, kind of like you did, you should be skeptical. You should always be skeptical. And even if you agree with something, you should always be open to being proven wrong. So to me, it's not so much, because a lot of people, when they find out that she accepts the Kensington runestone as an authentic, as being real, they think she's one of these crackpots. And it's like, no, you really got to look at the rest of what she says, because really she's just willing to be open-minded where a lot of people aren't.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Take that how you want to take it, but I think I admire that, because it takes a lot of bravery to do that. I'm not willing to say that. I think it's fake. But All right,
the book was published in 2005, Waveland Press, and the title is The Kensington Runestone: Approaching a Research Question Holistically. So it's a short monograph. Alice is a really good writer, and it's an interesting.
She's an excellent writer. It's easy to read.
It's a really interesting book. I think she's wrong in the conclusions she reaches, because again, Alice is fully cognizant of the fact that the archaeological record does not provide, in Wisconsin and Minnesota, does not provide supporting evidence for the authenticity of the runestone.
And I think that's why she eventually changed her stance. But again, I'm going to chase her down and see if I can't.
That'd be great. Just to
give me a yay or a nay on that.
Exactly. And none of that was a criticism of her. It's just that, listen, there's an argument for its authenticity. I think the argument is lacking, primarily because all the rest of it falls away if you have no physical archaeological evidence. I mean, look, the deal here with all of these artifacts is that I admit, as an archaeologist, let's go back to the Norse. So there's really clear evidence of the Norse in northeastern Canada and Newfoundland. When you ask people today, well, who who discovered America? And if you say Columbus, they go, no, 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 it was Leif Erikson. But in fact, even that's not true. Leif Erikson was merely following the directions of another Norse guy whose name is Bjarni Herjolfsson. The problem is Bjarni never made landfall. Bjarni got lost. Bjarni is sailing off the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland and New Brunswick, and he's saying, wow, this is an interesting place. But he turned around and went back to Greenland. And it wasn't until Leif came that there was landfall made and then a settlement. So the deal is, as an archaeologist, I can neither confirm nor dispute the discussion about Bjarni Herjolfsson. Because, of course, there's not going to be any physical evidence of him in the New World because he never made landfall.
Right.
And then you say, well, what if he had made landfall, walked around for 15 minutes, got back in the boat and left? Again, that has not obtained there's an archaeological threshold that he has not reached. How about if he and his guys overnighted on Newfoundland, they had a fire, maybe they cooked a fish, and then they left? Again, maybe they have not yet reached enough of an archaeological threshold that we would find that. But that's not the case. In the examples we were given here, in the case of the Newark Holy Stones, the Kensington Rune Stones, the Bat Creek Stone in Tennessee, and a number of the Davenport tablets in Iowa, we are being asked to know, in fact, Barry Fell, who's one of the champions of the Celtic writing in New England, he talked about the existence of Celtic kingdoms in the New World before Columbus.
Barry Fell talks about a lot of crazy shit, though.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you've got that kind of a population commitment and that kind of a time commitment, where that has reached a threshold that archaeologists are going to absolutely expect to find significant material evidence, archaeological remains, stuff that we would look at and go, wait, that's not Native American. That's not European. That's not colonial. Wow, that's something else.
Right.
We don't have that evidence.
Well, I bring up the Kensington Runestone mainly because I knew that there was a controversy at the academic level, people for and against. And I wanted people to know that these things do exist and that when there is a controversy, we don't cover it up, because that's another problem. We get accused of covering up controversies. And it's like, no, this is a legit controversy. Most people don't agree with it, but there is at least one person who's a holdout.
Yeah. Well,
so
listen, in the case of Lonso Meadow is the village site on Newfoundland, which we think was Vinland, in which archaeologists in the 1960s actually found that's a Norse village. That's 500 years before Columbus. But you know, the original location, the original claim that, well, the Norse had made it to the New World was based on the Viking sagas, two sagas in particular, Eric the Red Saga and the Greenlander Saga, which talked about sailing west of Greenland. It described 3 lands, and it described landfall on one of those lands. Historians and archaeologists were largely, not unanimously, but largely skeptical, because there was no physical evidence for it. It was like, well, that's an interesting story, and we can't disprove it, but there's no proof. There's no evidence to back it up. But then, just as you were saying, when physical evidence was forthcoming, when people said, hey, look, when the Ingstadts, Anstein, Ingstadt, and Helg Ingstadt, actually the archaeology had said, look, we have a bronze artifact here. We have iron boat rivets. We have a soapstone spindle whorl made from a soapstone that's not available in Newfoundland. We have fireplaces where they were smelting iron. We have foundations of houses that look like Viking boots. They don't look anything like local ancient structures. When that evidence was forthcoming, all of the archaeological and historical skeptics came around to their way of thinking. That's absolute firm proof that if you provide us with the right kind of evidence, we change our minds.
Yeah.
However, and it's important to point out, sometimes I'll hear people on kind of the fringes say, see, archaeologists were wrong. You know, being skeptical. I don't think archaeologists and historians ever said the sagas are complete crap. There's no way it could be true. In fact, what most people said was well, that's interesting, but we don't think it's true because there's no evidence for it. That's being skeptical.
Right.
If you give us evidence, well, yeah, okay, you got it. Now you've proven it. Now you've provided the kinds of evidence that we would expect to find if that were true. And that's the way science works. It's not wrong to be skeptical. It's right to be skeptical until sufficient diagnostic convincing evidence is forthcoming.
And we will be right back after this break to finish our discussion out about different writings in America.
The CRM Archaeology podcast brings together a panel of cultural resource management professionals to discuss the issues that really matter to the profession. Find out about networking strategies, job hunting, graduate programs, and much more. We'll often feature interviews with college professors, CRM business owners, and experts as well. Check out the show on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/CRM Arc Podcast. Let's get back to the show.
And we are back to finish up our discussion. Right before we left, you were talking about Crack Cave.
Yeah, there's a place called Crack Cave. It's actually I think it's a national grassland, but you didn't know we had national grasslands administered by the federal government. It's in southeastern Colorado, pretty close to its border with Oklahoma, which who knew that Colorado had a border with Oklahoma, right? But there's a cave in there with lines, scratch marks, which have been interpreted as Ogam, Ogam, which is a written form of, I guess, Irish. It's a form of writing that's seen in Western Europe, primarily Ireland, and it usually consists of a horizontal line and then vertical lines up and down off of that, and whether or not there are vowels, and it's a whole big deal. And most of this stuff is not particularly ancient, but it's legit in Ireland. And it
had a very short time span of use,
right?
And if you get online and look up actual Ogam, and I'll see if I can't link something decent. It's very distinct,
right? Yeah.
Especially once you compare it to what I think you're getting ready to say. But if you compare it to writings in America that are supposedly Ogam, it's very clear that these are not Ogam.
Yeah. A bunch of years ago, a couple of Celtic experts from the UK, Anne Ross was one of them, came to the New World to inspect some of the ostensible Ogam writing here. And these are folks who had no dog in this hunt. They had no connection to anybody here in America, but they were experts in Ogam in the Old World. And they were fascinated that maybe some of these Celts got to the New World and they left these Ogam inscriptions. And their conclusions were kind of impolite, saying that it was a semantic fantasy to believe that any of this stuff that they were looking at was legitimate Ogam. They said, no, absolutely not.
They're very direct people.
Yes, exactly. That it was a complete fantasy. But it was another one, as we were saying. All right, supposing Celts made it to the New World. How in the hell did they get to eastern Colorado? What are they doing there? All these folks have to sail across the Atlantic. But again...
And how did they get all the way there without leaving any other evidence of them traveling there? Did they just materialize? Did they get beamed down from the mothership?
That harks back to our conversation before. That in historical instances where we know people, foreigners, moved through the New World, DeSoto and his guys, they left a trail.
Yeah.
We can trace their movements through the American Southeast by looking for the artifacts, the stuff that's diagnostically theirs.
We can trace prehistoric people's migrations across the country that way as well. I mean, it's not just a modern phenomena. We can trace, for example, the distribution of corn and maize across the country, the distribution of beans and squash. And that's how or just pottery styles, or the way that they would do the quill decoration and that kind of stuff. It's a very reliable method to keep track of just about anybody we can keep track of. And the fact that you've got Celts materializing in Colorado, I mean, that should tell you something.
Yeah. And another thing, trace element chemistry. So that,
exactly.
In other words,
But that's new. That's newer.
That's newer. But you know what? When I was an undergraduate in college in the early 1970s, my prof, when we were doing trace element chemistry, movement of turquoise from between the American Southwest and Mexico. So that has been around for a while, and that you can look at the archaeology of virtually any part of the world where people have been able to draw lines, trade routes, and the movement of people on the basis of this kind of obsidian is not found here naturally. The nearest source is 500 miles away. So we can connect those two places. And again, in the case of the spindle whorl at Lanceau Meadow, trace element chemistry has shown that's not local. That's not a soapstone that comes from Newfoundland. That comes from either Greenland or Iceland. So we know that was brought in. And the thing is, again, not a single object found in a pre-Columbian context in the New World, other than the stuff in Eastern Canada, not a single object has been traced to a source in the Old World. And oh my gosh, here we got this writing in Colorado. Here we have these artifacts in Colorado that are stratigraphically in a pre-Columbian context, and they are directly physically traceable to some source in Germany or Poland or Egypt or Scotland or Ireland. None. Zero.
Yeah.
And then the bottom line here is, for folks who are critical of archaeologists, saying, yes, but you're closed, you're only looking at archaeological stuff. Well, what the hell do you think we're going to be looking at? We're archaeologists. Right. That's what we deal in.
Well, and what else is there to look at?
Well, the writing.
I mean, not to be weird, but I'm not knocking anybody else, but what are you going to look at? Geological evidence?
Well, I think what their argument, again, it's a lack of understanding. It's this belief that people could come to the New World, kind of leave a secret message, graffiti, and then run away without spending time here, a substantial enough period of time that they would lose stuff, throw stuff away, that stuff would be found.
I'm still just stuck on what other thing would you look at? I mean, it's like, that's what the field of study does.
Exactly. Well, yeah. But I think that they're kind of in a corner and having to say, no, we can't rely on archaeology because they know the archaeological evidence isn't there. Now, the thing is, I mean, there certainly was a time when the folks who believed that there was a substantial Old World presence in the New World in antiquity, they recognized that the archaeological record could provide them with support. Of one of the most well-known sites, at least here in New England, it's a place called, when I was a kid, it was called Mystery Hill. Now it's called America's Stonehenge.
Yes.
Well, back in the 1950s, they actually hired a graduate student, Gary Vasilius, who's a grad student in archaeology at Yale. And they said, yes, we need an archaeologist here to dig this place up, to find the physical evidence that archaeologists would require to believe that this is an ancient. At the time, I think they first believed it was Irish monks in like 500 AD. And later on with Barry Fell, it got pushed back earlier. But so when Gary Vasilius, so I actually got to meet and talk to him. He passed away for a few years ago, but he gave a paper. We invited him to give a paper about his dig in at Mystery Hill. And he said, yes, that they actually found thousands of artifacts at that site. And all of them were either under the stone. This is an area with lots of stone walls and stone chambers. And all the artifacts they found were either Native American or colonial, 18th century, 19th century stuff. And that was the whole of it. That there was nothing from, I'll tell you my cheap, hilarious story. This is a story when I tell students, they don't laugh. When I tell a group of archaeologists, they fall down laughing. All right. So I was at Mystery Hill when it was still Mystery Hill. And they made a much nicer museum there now, and it's a fun place, really interesting place. And they have llamas there now, so why, I'm not sure. But in any event, they had a small museum, and they had a whole series of glass cases with colonial stuff. I mean, whiteware and hand-wrought nails. So clearly there was a colonial presence, an 18th and 19th century presence at the site. On the side of this little museum was a glass case full of stone tools. And the stone tools looked like typical stuff from southern New England and middle of New England.
Okay.
At the time, they were advertising the site as being a Bronze Age settlement in the New World.
Right.
So I approached the person at the front desk and I said, "So this is a Bronze Age settlement?" She said, "Yes." And I said, "Where are all the bronze artifacts?"
Right.
Her reaction, you ready for her reaction, Sarah? It was, "Well, you don't think those ancient people would have just left those bronze artifacts lying around, do you?" And I said, "Well, but excuse me, they did in fact leave those valuable bronze artifacts lying around in Europe. That's how we know it was the Bronze Age."
Bronze Age.
And so apparently her argument was that the kinds of artifacts I was demanding be there to support the claim that this was a Bronze Age site, you wouldn't expect to find because the people would have picked them all up and, I don't know, put them away for safekeeping. That is the most naive, bizarrely naive statement about archaeology that's imaginable. When you look at all the cool stuff that we dig up, yeah, at some point, somebody lost it, sucked it, put it away for safekeeping. Yeah, we find it.
It's an easy way to dodge the question. It's like the miracle of faith argument. Of course there's no artifacts because they took them with them. Well, though that's not how this works.
Right. Oh yeah.
I mean, you can't claim it's Bronze Age if there's no bronze. That's just how that works.
That really is how that works, isn't it?
That's kind of the definition.
Ultimately, how would you know it's the Bronze Age?
Exactly.
You got to find bronze. How would you know it's the Iron Age? How would you know it's any age unless you had direct physical evidence of that? And I've tried arguing this point that if I were to tell you that a murder had happened in the lecture hall where I'm going to teach my intro archaeology class, but the criminal was a perfect genius and left no physical evidence behind of that murder. There's nothing here but trust me, there was a murder here. There's not a police department in the country that would prosecute anybody on the claim that, well, it happened, but trust me that it happened. There's no physical evidence for it.
It's the argument of the dragon in your garage. It's the same argument that Sagan makes about other things in his baloney detection kit.
Yeah. I mean, and you know, I've heard this. And this is a statement or a philosophy that actually bothers me, and it's the claim that what is it? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Now, well, technically that's true.
Well, okay, now. Here's the point. Yeah. Sagan does make the statement of the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but he is making it as a way of describing an individual who is impatient and who demands evidence when there is none.
Okay.
He himself is not saying that absence of evidence is evidence of absence because clearly it is. And that is the point he is making.
I'm sure you've heard that people will say, "Wow."
It's an unfortunate misquote, and I have made to tout my blog. I have made a post explaining this to people that is not.
People need to read that. They need people. To read.
Well, yeah, it's a quote taken out of context from Carl Sagan's book, which if you read the paragraph that it comes out of, because it's 2 lines out of an entire paragraph.
Okay.
If you read the entire paragraph, he clearly states that the demands of people like that can be summed up in the statement of
I gotcha.
The absence of evidence is evidence of, or whatever.
Right. No, I hear you exactly. But I mean, and you know, my reaction.
But it is unfortunately used against people a lot. Just because you didn't find anything doesn't mean there's nothing there. Actually, it does.
When I hear that, I say, listen, I don't think there's an elephant living in my house.
Right.
Because there's no evidence of that elephant. I think that's pretty goddamn good proof that absence of evidence is evidence of absence. And the fact is, maybe if I make that claim this second and you've never been to my house, you go, okay, well, let's look. After about 5 minutes of looking, I think in that case, evidence of absence certainly is the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. You know,
right.
It's kind of like the argument that just one more research project and maybe we'll prove there's such a thing as ESP, or maybe if one more mega study of UFOs, maybe the next time. So never close. And I get that idea. You never want to close the door entirely on some
but sometimes
hypothesis.
you gotta walk away from things for a while, you know.
Yeah, well, listen, it's also,
Or it could all for forever.
yeah, well, it's also, I mean, it definitely is the case that I kind of end up feeling badly for people who devoted their lives to something, and you look at them and you go, listen, you've been looking for this phenomenon for 50 years.
Yeah.
When is it time to throw up your hands and go, I guess I was wrong? And that's okay. It's perfectly okay to be a scientist who in the end is proven wrong, because by proving something wrong, you are taking a step forward in our understanding of some element of reality or the world.
And that opens up an entirely different conversation that is a very important conversation to have, and that's the fear of failure or the fear of non-success in science, and the fact that negative studies very rarely get published, if ever get published, and we're only and it's true in archaeology too. We're only interested in publishing things that show whatever they were going after, which creates a bias.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Or at least it creates the appearance of a bias, which complicates things for you and I in the long run, because we have to say, look, we have failures all the time. And then people can come back and go, well, I never see them. And it's like, well, you don't. And that's the sad part.
Yeah. Well, listen, I use that line in the field all the time. And while I believe it, I understand the problem. So we'll be at some really cool place, and there'll be some poor student who's sitting there digging a test pit and finding absolutely nothing. And I'll walk over and I'll say, oh, and they'll look, everybody's fine. I'm not finding anything at all. And I look at them and say, yes, but that's important. It's important to know that right here in the site you haven't found anything. And that's what I tell them. I say negative evidence is as important as positive evidence. And they nod their head, and I walk away, and I kind of giggle to myself, because I know being a human being, you would much rather be the one digging the test pit where you're finding a spear point or a potsherd or a bone, because that certainly is more gratifying. But in terms of the actual science, we need to know that part of the site was not a part where there are necessarily a whole lot of material remains.
Yeah, somebody's got to eat that frog, and unfortunately, it was you.
There you go. Exactly. But you're right,
well, Ken.
You're right. National Geographic tends not to spend a lot of money on somebody who comes out and says, "Well, that was a dead end."
That'd be an awesome show, though.
Yeah.
National Geographic presents Dead Ends.
Yeah.
It's just a bunch of false positives.
Exactly.
Negative shovel tests. This has been an interesting show.
Oh, I think so. I think we did a lot of beating around the bush, but it was important to do that.
I think we've covered a lot of ground in this one, though. We may come back and revisit some of this stuff, but I feel like we got a lot of groundwork laid in this episode.
Oh, I think absolutely. And then we just have to find out if Alice Kehoe has, in fact, changed her opinion about the Kensington Stone or not.
Even if she hasn't, it might be fun to convince her to come on the show and just see what you two will do. I may just mute my mic and let you two go at it. Because from what I hear, she is not a pushover.
Oh my God, no. She's
not demure in any way, shape, or form.
Not at all. She's tough, and she's really smart.
Yeah.
She knows her stuff. That's fine. I know my stuff too, and I'm wrong about some things, I'm sure. So that's okay. It's fine.
I think there have been people writing and asking for real controversies, and I'm like, well, the sad part is there's not that many, honestly, as far as the pseudo-archaeology end of it goes. I mean, there's some deep philosophical and methodological discussions, but that's not really the scope of the show.
Yeah, and for most people, that's kind of boring.
Yeah, and you really don't want to listen to a podcast about that, trust me. Right. I don't want to listen to it.
Well, processual archaeology, post-processual archeology, symbolic archaeology, that's all interesting, and about 4 people are dedicated to that. But this is the kind of stuff that I think is... It's important for folks to know, listen, there's really interesting archaeology going on, and this stuff on the fringe is a misrepresentation of what we really know about the past, and it's important to know what really happened.
Actually, if you really want, if our listeners really are interested in hearing modern debates about modern archaeology, the CRM Archaeology podcast, the parent podcast to this one, it comes out bi-weekly. Chris Webster's the head of that show. It's on the Archaeological Podcast Network. Just type in archaeologicalpodcastnetwork.com and look for the CRM podcast. They discuss all kinds of stuff about modern archaeology, modern methods, modern debates. I don't know if they get too much into theory anymore. Right. We never really did, but they do talk about a lot of things that are important to the field. So if that's what you're looking for, give that a listen. Don't quit listening to us, but add that to your podcast list. And
yes, but it's important to point out that I would bet you that on none of those podcasts will you hear Carl Sagan and George Carlin quoted in the same context.
That's true.
Absolutely.
That is true. I don't honestly think we've talked much about Carl Sagan on that show. But anyway.
Cool.
All right, final thought, Ken?
No, I mean this was great. This was interesting. I think that ultimately it's important to understand that archaeologists we actually have an open mind about this. We are not committed to a particular worldview about this, but we are scientists who require, demand a certain kind of evidence to convince us. And that evidence is certainly not forthcoming. So in our application of Occam's razor, when you find the Hebrew writing in New Mexico, barring any supporting or confirming data, we're going to go with the fact that the thing's a fake, the thing is modern, until proven otherwise.
Right.
And the burden of proof is on those who claim it's real.
And if you can prove me wrong, I mean, that's okay. That would be really cool. People don't understand how cool I think it would be if these things were real. I mean, it would be neat. It's still not going to change reality, but it would be so cool to find some of this stuff.
I mean, that's as a general thing that we can talk about more later on. It's the skeptics who would be probably the most pleased if somebody were to prove us wrong. The people I know who are the most skeptical about Bigfoot would be the ones who would be beside themselves with delight if somebody were to prove there was a Bigfoot. And I got to tell you, if somebody at some point were to discover direct, definitive evidence of extraterrestrial aliens having visited the Earth in the past, you put Eric von Daniken and Giorgio together, and it would not be as jazzed as I would be. I swear to you. But the thing is, it pisses me off when people claim it, and I know the evidence isn't there.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, I was the same way with the Vikings thing. When Lots of Meadows finally came out, I was like, woo! Yeah! Because I was so tired of all of the bullshit with the fake stuff. But anyway.
Cool. Been real.
All right, man. Good episode.
We'll talk more next time, and hopefully there'll be like a horrible weather front will come through, so nobody on a motorcycle will drive by my house.
Yeah, right. All right, man. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. Ranger trials as one will call. No, we don't.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosoup Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at archifantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. Thanks again for listening.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle and was edited by Josh Phoebus.
We don't do dinosaurs. Ranger trials as one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs. See? Are you happy? Do you get it now? Do you get it? Honestly.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.